bioethics,
law, euthanasia,
consumerism,
politics, terrorism,
globalization,
religion,
migrant population,
interfaith, drug addiction.
Thanks to Dr. Chi and to ETHOS for this invitation, and to the Bible Society for hosting this meeting, and to you for coming and taking part in it. Our topic, as you know, is developing leadership in or for the public square. The topic both intrigues and interests us, and for good or for ill, we are influenced by the people who do lead us, whether it's on the larger stage of our world and our cities, or in the smaller stage of the organisations of which we're a part. Why is this the case? If you go back even half a century, you'll find very little written on the topic. You'll find very little said about the topic from any particular quarter. Obviously there were leaders, but they did not make as much news as they do today. We were not as interested in following their everyday activities, exploits, failures, successes. There must be something about our kind of society which has made us change our attitude in this whole area. Is it because we fear that leadership is not what it used to be? Is it because we feel less confident ourselves about what is happening in the world and organisations around us, and therefore look for something more solid, more dependable, in the way of people to show us the way? Is it because occasionally we come across leaders who are extremely fascinating, effective, influential, admirable, people whom we would like to perhaps be like or to follow? It's hard to know. But certainly leadership in the public square is something which has become much more of public interest. And what I want to talk about is three aspects of this, the first of which is, in this important arena of life, the so-called public scene or square as we call it, where should and will such leadership come from? Mostly in the past it's come from a social elite or from an educated elite, and these two might often be the same sorts of people. This has happened certainly in Asian societies like Singapore, but it's also happened, at least until fairly recent times, and still in many places in Western countries as well. In Britain, for example, still, political leaders at least tend to come from better off families and from public schools, the big schools. Will this be the case in the future? Many people doubt that it will be and doubt that it should be. In fact, they're somewhat desperately worried that this old pattern of drawing leaders only from a certain select circle of people is not the thing that will lead us at any level into the future in the way that we would desire. In fact, increasingly, the word is out that the leaders of the future could come from anywhere in our social makeup, and that they could be anyone who is part of the fabric of our society. In the past, this has certainly been demonstrated as a good direction to look, at least at times. certainly in the military, from World War I at least, things have changed from when a particular social class and people from a particular educational achievement were the ones who automatically became officers and led the men into battle. It wasn't just that it was often those men who were wiped out amongst the first to be killed when battles actually took place, but also because they often did not prove terribly effective. And when they were not in charge, the ones who were promoted from the ranks to take their place, often from the underclass, the working class, or from schools which weren't particularly highly achievement-oriented, but who had good experience in the army, who had good military instincts when it came to battle, who knew how to actually lead men of a wide range of types. These were the ones who proved their mettle and, in the long run, in many cases, won the war. In the church, this is becoming increasingly something that people are conscious of. During my time at Fuller Theological Seminary, a study was done by one of the big theological organisations in the United States to try and work out what was the relationship between academic achievement in a seminary and pastoral effectiveness in a church. The results were deeply troubling and surprising. Academic success was only a 20% predictor of pastoral effectiveness. The other 80% proved to be far more influential in the long run. All sorts of other talents, gifts, wisdom, abilities were required in order for a pastor to be effective in a congregation. The military and the church are two very different organisations, but the best people, pastorally speaking, were mostly those who did not achieve that high academically in their seminary training. Leadership involves more than academic intelligence. It involves practical intelligence. It involves emotional intelligence. It involves creative intelligence. And these are not the sorts of things which educational institutions are very good at either teaching or measuring. Increasingly, in fact, in leadership literature, as well as the stress being laid alongside knowledge upon practice, emotional maturity, and creative ability, it is now being said spiritual intelligence is highly important in the development of the leaders of the future. And this is not Christians necessarily saying this, it's people of a broader religious and not specifically Christian outlook. Since practical, emotional, creative and spiritual intelligence can develop and appear in all sorts of people from all walks of life, with or without all kinds of educational training, then all sorts of people become potential key leaders, not only in organisations but in the public square in particular. Increasingly in the leadership literature, it is being said that leadership is not a noun based on someone's position in society or upon the title that they are given, but it is actually a verb based on people's actions and actual achievement. In Christian circles still, leadership is still too often viewed as first a solo activity, one person at the top, secondly as a top-down activity, from the top down by chain of command. And thirdly, as a directive activity in which instructions are issued and leadership takes place primarily through command itself of one kind or another. This leads everyone else to conclude that, well, I'm probably not a leader and never can be, since only very few ever make it. If I am not near the top of my organisation, however gifted or talented I might be, certainly I should not regard myself and could never become a leader. And if I'm not a forceful, directive and commanding type of person, then certainly I don't have qualifications that could make me a leader. None of this is actually true. None of it is actually Christian. None of it is actually very biblical. In fact, leadership is often a joint or team or group venture, not just a soloist activity. Leadership is often something which happens from the sidelines or from the middle, not necessarily from the top, and it can even happen from the bottom up. The best leadership is not by command, but it is by persuasion, by mentoring, by example, as well as clear statements. And this is not something which is just part of people's general experience in all sorts of different organisations or walks of life, but it is something which is quite biblical as well. God found many leaders from other quarters than the upper strata of society or the most educated in the land. Take David for one, a shepherd, a young shepherd. Jeremiah for another, a young man who felt he had no particular qualifications to speak out and challenge those in most influential positions in his society. Esther, drafted in certainly as the king's consort, but just out of her teenage years, or perhaps still in them, without any of the social networks or educational advantages that even certain other women may have had in her own day. Leadership is often not just one person centred, but involves a group of people: Moses, Miriam and Aaron, Ezra and Nehemiah, Paul and his team, Timothy, Titus, Luke and others. Someone has counted up all the names involved in Paul's team at one point or another, and there are actually 32 named in the New Testament. Paul always worked with a team, and as we'll see later, in a particular way with a team, not just as the main person issuing commands to his subordinates. This was so in the church as well. In the early church, we actually never get reference to a single person as a pastor of a particular congregation. It's always a group, and not untypical is the reference in 1 Corinthians 16:9 to Stephanas and his household as the preeminent people in the church in Corinth. That includes his wife, no doubt his lead slaves, and just to make the point, Paul adds, not just them, but others who take their example and operate in the way that they do. My translation of the remaining words in that verse. And leadership wasn't just by command or dictate or by order. If we look at Paul, the words that most commonly come before us in his writings are words like, I urge you, I appeal to you, I plead with you, I seek to persuade you. In fact, only twice in all his writings does he issue a command using that particular word. And that was to a church which was totally losing its way in order to shock them back to their senses. But normally it's not the kind of thing which he does. The fact that leadership is something which can be generated in all sorts of people is something which is more generally referred to in the Old Testament in passages like the promise in Jeremiah 31, where God says, I will put my law in their hearts and minds, and I will write it in their, I'll put my law in their minds, and I will write it in their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will a man say to his neighbour or his brother, know the Lord, because they will all know me from the least to the greatest. This is picked up, of course, in the New Testament. In Acts 2, 16, 18, and fulfilled in an even far greater way when the Spirit comes, as it says, in the last days, God says, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, and young men will see visions. Old men will dream dreams even. In those days when I pour out my Spirit upon all people. This is why in the early church it wasn't just one or two or three people who, when the Christians gathered together, contributed powerfully and influentially to what took place, but everyone was granted a gift. Everyone was encouraged to contribute in some way to the nurture, the encouragement, the consolation, the instruction of the whole group when it met together. Involved in teaching, involved in pastoring, involved in prophesying. There were, of course, always some who were more mature, more experienced, more gifted than others, who enabled this to take place in very striking ways. But this did not rule out the contribution of the rest of the members of the group. So there is good biblical basis for thinking of leadership as coming from any possible person, from any possible quarter, not just by looking to a particular group or few. And certainly leadership literature in the last decade or more has increasingly emphasised this without any of course, knowledge in most cases that there is some kind of biblical basis for it. I mentioned just a few examples. Ram Charan's book, Leadership at All Levels, published just a few years ago. The book by David Kalko, Everyone a Leader, A Guide to Leading High-Performance Organizations, for engineers and scientists who are often regarded as requiring high technical skills and only few amongst them having the additional abilities which leadership might involve. Peter Dean, Leadership for Everyone, How to Become a Motivator, Influence and Leader. Mark Seaborn, You Don't Need a Title to be a Leader. How from anyone, anywhere, a positive difference can be made. Frederick Alexander, We are all potential leaders. Leadership is not a position, it's a mindset. And so I could go on. Laurie Chamberlain, in an interesting article called Cultivating Leadership Amongst All sorts of people in your organisation, says leadership is found up and down the whole leadership ladder, up and down the whole ladder in an organisation. It's there not just in the boardroom, but it's as much present in the actual mailroom. And the most recent studies indicate that even those who are lower down the organisation, compared to those who are higher up the organisation, exhibit at their own level exactly the same sorts of attitudes, dispositions, abilities and skills as those at the top. That basically what makes a person a real contributor and influencer at even the lowest level is exactly the same kinds of things and qualities and behaviours which are characteristic of those at the highest levels of the institution. There are a few minor differences, but on the whole, the differences are not hugely significant. There's a summary of the sorts of things which characterise those who are involved in leading others at all kinds of levels in all kinds of ways in the Old Testament. It's by John Goldingay in his discussion of Old Testament leadership at the end of his quite massive but very practical 3-volume theology of the Old Testament. And he says these are the sorts of things which are central features of what leadership involves that reappear in all sorts of people, in all sorts of places, at all sorts of levels. The importance of keeping promises made to people. The maintaining of agreements and contracts or covenants. The developing of trust with others through behaving consistently. Good stewardship of resources and sharing of prosperity. Giving a voice to those who are disadvantaged. Building relationships and community among those around you. Generating hope in others and some kind of vision for what is coming. Encouraging creative efforts and designing opportunities for people to make use of them. Interesting. So that is my first point. Leaders of the future will not come just from a specific class or those who have a specific educational record. It should and will come from all sorts of people who exhibit these sorts of qualities, and it should only come from people who exhibit those sorts of qualities, and it doesn't matter what class they belong to, and it doesn't matter how well they achieved academically at a school. Moving on from there to a second facet of leadership, which we require if we require not just better leaders in our churches or businesses or government departments, but in the wider public square as a whole. What qualities do such people need most of all? We often focus on technical skills, technical abilities, if not on academic skills and academic activities, abilities. These have a place, but they are not the only thing that is important and not always necessarily the main thing that is important. The technical side of our brain, the left side of our brain, has much to offer, but the right side of our brain also has much, and within that the catalytic role of imagination in those who have something to contribute in organisations and in our wider society is most important. being able to see and envision new things, being able to see and envision new ways of doing things, being able to see and envision new ways of communicating things. All of these come from the imagination, not from our technical skills and training. In fact, much work has been done recently on the importance of what we might call word pictures, metaphors, in seeking to both understand something, work out how to do something, and in particular, how best to express it to other people in a way which will really catch their attention, motivate them, and draw them into whatever you would encourage them to do. Indeed, the more work that is done on the way the brain actually functions, the more it becomes clear is that little pictures like this are the things that actually help us to understand the deepest things that we can possibly seek to explore. It's not that thinking comes first with our cognitive facilities and then we find more picturesque ways of somehow wrapping around that to make sense of it or to convey it to others. It's the pictures that come first and the thinking that actually follows suit. See the book by George Lakoff and Mark Johnston, Metaphors We Live By. Not just even think by, but actually live by. It's the imagination which enables us to step back a little from whatever it is that we might be seeking to understand or to do, to look at it from a particular angle or to move around it and look at it from various angles, to actually question things that we are seeking to know or seeking to do, and in the process find deeper understanding of what it is that we need to know and how to actually put it into practice.